The wind swept through the crystalline spires of Arath, whispering against the towering structures with a haunting hum. Beneath the glow of the twin moons, Vishari stood at the very edge of a jagged precipice, her bare feet pressing into the smooth stone. As she faced the void, the cliff stretched down endlessly into the shadowed valley below, where the bioluminescent flora pulsed in soft waves, casting an eerie glow that danced between the rocks. To anyone else standing here would be madness, but for Vishari it was the only place where she felt truly free. She tilted her head slightly, listening not just to the wind, but to the subtle vibrations coursing through the stone beneath her. She felt the distant movements of creatures in the valley below, the rhythmic pulse of the planet's energy fields, and the far-off hum of artificial engines. Not of her world, they hummed. The distinct, heavy reverberation of human-made thrusters sent a ripple through the air, cutting through the organic symphony of Arath. Like a jagged wound, it was rare for outsiders to set foot here, even rarer for them to land in this region so far from the structured cities. Deep within the untamed cliffs of the Vathan wastes, Vishari frowned slightly. What business did the humans have here? But she wasn't afraid. She had lived as a ghost in her own world for far too long to fear outsiders. Her emerald green skin shimmered under the moonlight as the wind lifted her long golden hair, sending strands whipping around her shoulders like threads of liquid sunlight. She had always stood apart from the others of her kind, not just because of her blindness, but because she was considered a blemish on her family's honor. Among the Arathi, perfection was paramount. Their culture was built upon elegance, precision, and the pursuit of intellectual and physical mastery. Flaws, whether of the body or the mind, were seen as imperfections unfit for high society. In Vishari she had been born without the gift of sight, something unheard of among her people. Her father, a high-ranking official in the Arath Dominion, had once adored her, showering her with attention as if his love alone could compensate for what others deemed a curse. But his affection had waned over the years, withering under the weight of societal expectation, until he could no longer bear to look at her at all. When he remarried, Vishari became an afterthought, a shameful secret locked away in the family's estate, barely tolerated and never acknowledged. Yet, despite their rejection, she refused to break. She laughed often. She wandered the world by touch and sound, finding beauty in the unseen. She discovered the way the wind carried whispers through the cliffs, how the vibrations in the ground told her stories no one else could hear. The Arathi saw her as less, but in her own way she saw more than any of them ever would. And now, standing on the ledge, she felt something new, a presence. The ship had landed nearby. Heavy footsteps crunched against the stone. A human was approaching. Then came the voice, low, rough, edged with irritation. "What the hell are you doing up there?" Vishar didn't startle at the abrupt intrusion. Instead, a slow smile curved her lips. She recognized the texture of his voice, not just the sound of it, but the weight of it in the air, the way it carried authority without arrogance. "I'm listening," she answered simply. A pause. "Listening to what?" The storm, she said, lifting her chin slightly. "It's coming from the south. I can feel the way the wind shifts." There was another pause, this one longer. The human wasn't sure what to make of her. Finally, he exhaled sharply, "You do realize you're about half a step from falling to your death, right?" She laughed softly. "I do." The sound of shifting boots against stone. He had moved closer, probably trying to figure her out. "And you're not worried about that?" Vishari turned slightly, facing the direction of his voice, though her silver-hued sightless eyes gave no indication of focus. She could sense him now, the warmth of his body and the cool night air, the slow and steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He was standing with his weight balanced, ready to react, as if expecting her to slip at any moment. She smiled. Would warring change anything? That seemed to throw him for a long moment. He said nothing. Vishari imagined he was staring at her, caught between frustration and curiosity. At last, he let out a small grunt. "That's a hell of a way to look at things. I prefer to look at things in the way that suits me best." A rough chuckle. "Looking might not be your strong suit." The words had barely left his mouth before he groaned under his breath. "That was true," she finished for him, amusement dancing in her voice. He didn't reply right away. and she could almost hear the smirk forming on his lips. Vishari took a step forward, closing the space between them. The closer she got, the more details she picked up: the faint scent of metal and engine grease, the worn leather of his jacket, the sharp ozone of lingering plasma burns from recent combat. A soldier then, or at least someone who had seen a fair share of war. She lifted her hand, slightly hesitating. "May I?" His voice was wary. "May you what touch your face?" A sharp breath. What? Vishar's smile remained. "I've never seen a human before. I want to know what you look like." A heartbeat of hesitation. Then, finally, he let her fingertips brushed along his strong jawline, rough with stubble, then traced upward to the sharp angles of his cheekbones. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his nose straight but slightly crooked at the bridge, a past break, never properly set. She mapped his face carefully, the way his brow furrowed slightly, the hint of tension at the corners of his mouth. "You feel different from my people," she murmured, letting her fingers linger just a little longer than necessary. Then, with a tilt of her head, she asked, "Are you considered handsome among your kind?" The sound that escaped him was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "I don't know, never really asked." She smiled. "I think you must be." Something in the air between them shifted. The humor remained, but underneath it was something quieter, a new kind of awareness. He cleared his throat. "Kane," he said, finally, voice lower now. "Commander C. And you, Vishari?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. She could feel it in the way the air around him moved. "Well, Vishari," he said, exhaling, "I don't know how things work on this planet, but where I come from, people don't usually stand on cliffs for fun." Her lips twitched. "Then maybe your people should try it sometime." Kane let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Here, something else, you know." That she laughed softly, more to herself than to him. He was different from the others who had come before, not dismissive, not condescending, but intrigued. And for the first time in her life, Vishari found herself wondering what it would be like to truly be seen. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the jagged walls of the cave. The scent of burning embers mixed with the damp mineral scent of the stone, creating an earthy warmth that contrasted with the cold wind howling outside. Kane sat with his back against the uneven rock, one knee bent, watching Vishari as she ran her fingers over the cave floor, mapping the terrain in her own way. She had insisted on walking ahead. Despite the rocky path, her movements confident, effortless. He had expected her to stumble, to need his help, but she navigated the world in a way that made him question whether she was truly blind at all. There was something about her, the way she carried herself, the way she listened, as if she heard more than just sound. Kane exhaled and rubbed a hand over the stubble on his jaw. He had no idea why he was still here. He had delivered his message. The Arathi Council would receive the transmission soon enough, and his job would be done. He should be back on his ship prepping for departure. But instead, he had followed this strange green-skinned woman into the caves, watching her as she moved through the world like she belonged to it in a way he never had. "You're staring." Kane blinked. "Am I?" "Yes," she said, smiling slightly. "I can feel it." He let out a breath, leaning his head back against the rock. "Didn't realize I was that obvious." "You are," she teased, tracing her fingertips over the cool stone, feeling the natural ridges and formations. "Most people don't watch me for long. They either pity me or avoid me altogether." Kane frowned at that. "Why?" She turned her head toward him, those silver sightless eyes catching the firelight. "Because I make them uncomfortable. My existence is a reminder that imperfection is possible." He studied her for a long moment. "That's a load of." Vishari laughed softly, shaking her head. "To you, maybe, but to my people, everything must be controlled. Efficient physical flaws are considered a burden to the collective. If you're not contributing at your full potential, you are lesser." Kane scoffed. "That's not how it works where I'm from now." "No," he said, adjusting his position on Earth. "We've got people with all kinds of differences, physical, mental, whatever. Doesn't make them less, just makes them different." Vishari tilted her head, thoughtful. "And yet I've heard humans wage wars over their differences all the time." Kane's jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong. "Yeah, we've got our own share of stupidity, but the best of us don't throw people away just because they don't fit some perfect mold." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I should have been born human." Then he found himself staring again, caught by the way her lips curved, the way the firelight softened the sharp angles of her face. She was beautiful, not just in the way her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders, or the way her emerald skin gleamed under the dim light, but in the way she carried herself, in the way she never seemed to let the weight of the world crush her. He cleared his throat. "Why you come out here anyway?" She exhaled slowly, as if considering how much to tell them. "Because it's quiet," she said at last. "Because out here I'm not someone's failure. I'm just me." Kane nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had spent most of his life running from expectations, from responsibilities that felt like chains around his throat. He knew what it was like to want to escape. "You know," he said, after a moment, "if I had a daughter like you, I'd be damn proud." Vishar fingers stilled against the stone. She didn't say anything right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "I think my father was proud once." She ran her hand over the ridges in the cave floor, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "But my stepmother, she saw me as a stain on the family name. Over time, he started seeing me that way too." Kane clenched his fists. He had seen this before in every damn corner of the galaxy, people breaking each other down for the sake of appearances, for the sake of their precious traditions. He had no patience for it. "Well, screw them," he said bluntly. "They don't get to decide your worth." Vishari let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You're very direct." "Yeah, old subtlety was never my strong suit." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came when two people understood something unspoken. The fire crackled between them, the warmth pushing back against the chill of the cave. Then suddenly Vish's head snapped up. Kane noticed the change in her posture immediately. Her body tensed. Her fingers sped against the ground as if reading the vibrations through her skin. "What is it?" he asked, instantly on alert. "There's movement outside," she whispered. "Several of them." Kane was already reaching for his weapon, his pulse steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "Arathi." No, Vish's voice was tight. "Humans," Kane swore under his breath. Vishari rose to her feet with a quiet grace that almost seemed unnatural. "They're not friendly." Kane pulled his blaster free, checking the charge. "I figured." Thea turned toward him, stepping closer, her voice low, this spreading out surrounding the entrance. "We don't have much time." Kane glanced at her, realizing something. She wasn't just guessing. She knew exactly where they were. "How the hell can you tell all that?" he asked. Vishari hesitated, then finally admitted, "I can feel them, the way their footsteps vibrate through the ground, the way their heartbeats pulse in the air." Kane stared at her. "That's not just heightened senses, that's something else entirely." She didn't answer. The sound of approaching footsteps cut the conversation short. Kane moved fast, grabbing Vishari's wrist and pulling her behind a jagged rock formation, just as a figure stepped into the cave's entrance. Silhouetted against the firelight, the man was clad in reinforced armor, his visor reflecting the glow. He carried a plasma rifle, and the way he moved told Kane everything he needed to know. These weren't diplomats, they were mercenaries, and they were here for her. Kane tightened his grip on his blaster. Well, he had planned on leaving Earth quietly, finishing his mission without getting tangled in any more problems. But looking at Vishari now, her back against the stone, her breath steadied. Despite the danger closing in, he knew he wasn't walking away from this, not without her. The rain slammed against the cliffs in relentless sheets, turning the rocky terrain into a slick, treacherous expanse. The storm raged around them, drowning out all but the occasional crack of thunder. But even through the chaos, Vishari could feel them. They were closing in. She could sense their movements in the shifting ground, hear the precise mechanical rhythm of their steps. They were trained, disciplined, methodical killers, and they were coming for her. Kane was already moving, his grip firm around her wrist, as he pulled her toward the jagged outcroppings beyond the cave's entrance. His breath was steady, his mind calculating. He had assessed the situation in seconds and made his decision. Fight wasn't an option. Flight was. Vishari didn't argue. She had lived her life knowing when to stand her ground and when to run. This was a moment to run. They darted between the rocks, their boots splashing through the rain-soaked earth. The mercenaries hadn't seen them yet. The storm had bought them time, but that time was running out. "Keep low," Kane murmured beside her, his voice barely audible over the wind. She already was. Every step was measured, every movement precise. Despite the rain, despite the darkness, Vishari knew the terrain. She had spent years wandering these cliffs alone, learning the language of the ground, the way the air shifted around obstacles. The way life pulsed beneath her feet. Kane, for all his skill, was not of this place. His steps were heavier, less certain. She could tell he was trying to move with silence. But he was an outsider to the land. He relied on his sight. She relied on something deeper. She reached out, grasping his arm. Instead of his wrist, taking the lead. "Follow me," she whispered. Kane hesitated. But then he led her. They moved together, weaving through the labyrinth of stone, slipping through crevices barely wide enough for them to pass. The rain was an ally now, masking their footsteps, concealing them in the shifting darkness. But the enemy was relentless. A voice crackled through the storm, mechanized, cold, and far too close. Negative visual. "Spread out." "She's still here." Vishari tensed. They weren't leaving, they were hunting. She felt Kane's breath hitch beside her. He had heard it too. His grip on his blaster tightened. He leaned close to her ear. "We need to change tactics," he murmured. The ship. Vishari nodded. It was their only real chance. If they could reach it before the mercenaries regrouped, they had a shot at escaping. But it wasn't going to be easy. The ship loomed beyond the cliffs, sleek and black, its hull absorbing the dim light from the storm. It was hovering just above the ground. Its loading ramp extended, a clear sign that its occupants had expected a quick extraction. It was a mistake, and Kane was going to make them regret it. Emotion for her to stay low as they neared the ridge. Overlooking the ship from this angle, they had a full view of the landing zone. 5 hostiles, all heavily armed, positioned around the perimeter. Kane exhaled slowly. "That's a problem." Vasher, crouched beside him, didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, she said, "I can get closer." Kane's eyes snapped to her. "Absolutely not." She turned her head toward him, rain streaming down her face, her silver eyes unreadable. "They won't hear me. They won't sense me." He shook his head. "That's a hell of a risk." "It's our best chance." Kane cursed under his breath. He didn't like it. He didn't trust it, but deep down he already knew she was right. "Fine," he said finally. "But I'm not letting you go alone." A small smile flickered across her lips. "I never expected you to." Together they moved. The rain covered their approach, the storm cloaking their figures in shifting shadows. The mercenaries were focused outward, watching the cuffs for movement, not expecting danger to come from behind. Vishari felt the ground beneath her shift, subtly sensed the precise placement of every enemy, their movements feeding into her awareness like ripples in water. She stopped, turning her head slightly. 2 guards near the ramp, close together, easy to take down near the main thrusters, standing still, watching. 2 more circling the perimeter, pacing, distracted. She turned to Kane, voice barely above the wind. "Take the ones at the ramp. I'll handle the one near the thruster." He hesitated just for a moment. Then he nodded. They split. Kane moved like a shadow, silent and efficient. Vishari didn't see what happened. She only felt it, the faint shift of weight, the sudden lack of footsteps where there had been 2. Kane was fast, precise, deadly. Vishari reached the lone guard by the thruster. He was larger than her, armored, a heavy rifle slung over his shoulder, but he was unaware. He relied on sight and sound. Expecting an attack from the front, she moved differently. She felt the shift in the air as she stepped into his blind spot. She struck swift and precise, a sharp twist of his arm, a calculated press against the nerve clusters at his neck. He collapsed before he could cry out. The ship was theirs, but they had seconds before the others noticed. Kane was already at the control panel near the entrance, overriding the security lock. The moment the system beeped, Vishari felt the others turn. She heard the sharp snap of their weapons raising. Then a shot rang out. Kane shoved her inside the ship just as the first bolt seared past them. Visory hit the floor, rolling to the side as more plasma fire erupted around them. Kane was already up, slamming his fist against the control. The ramp began to rise. "Strap in," he barked. Vishari scrambled toward the cockpit, feeling her way through the unfamiliar ship with instinct and memory rather than sight. Kane was close behind, his hands moving over the controls with practiced ease. Engines roared to life outside. The mercenaries were shouting, their gunfire useless against the ship's reinforced hull. Then they were airborne. The sudden acceleration pressed her back into the seat. The storm raged outside, the turbulence shaking the ship violently, but Kane handled it with ease, navigating the chaos like it was just another day in the void. Vishari exhaled slowly. They had escaped for now. Kane glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "So you going to tell me why the hell those guys were so interested in you?" Vishari swallowed, gripping the seat's edge she had known. This question was coming. She had hoped she wouldn't have to answer it. "It's not what I done," she said. Quietly, "It's what I am." Kane's jaw tightened. "And what exactly is?" That she hesitated, then whispered something they were never supposed to let exist. The cockpit was silent except for the steady hum of the ship. Kane studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Great, another galactic conspiracy. Just what I needed." "Despite everything," Vishari smiled, "you didn't have to come with me. You know." Kane gave a short laugh. "Yeah. Well, call it bad judgment." She turned toward him, silver eyes unseeing but focused. "Or maybe good judgment." Kane shook his head, turning his attention back to the controls. One thing was clear. Whoever was after Vishari wasn't going to stop. And now he was tangled in it too. He just hoped he wouldn't live to regret it. The stolen ship cut through the storm, its engines roaring, as Kane pushed the controls to their limit. Rain streaked across the windshield in heavy sheets, lightning flashing in the distance, illuminating the jagged landscape they left behind. The mercenary ship was fast, but it was old, not built for pursuit. Kane wasn't sure if they had lost their pursuers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't stay on IR. Vishari sat beside him in the co-pilot seat, her hands gripping the edges as the ship lurched through the turbulent skies. She didn't flinch, didn't panic. She simply adjusted to the movement, her breathing steady. He hadn't known many people who could stay calm in the middle of a high-speed escape. He certainly wasn't one of them. "Are we clear?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Kane flicked a switch, bringing up the sensor readings. "No active pursuit." "But that didn't mean they were safe for now," he muttered, adjusting their trajectory. "But they'll track us the second we hit open space. We need to be gone before they can regroup." Vishari exhaled slowly. "Then take us anywhere. But here." C's hands moved over the controls. "That I can do." The ship shot forward, cutting through the last remnants of the storm before breaking free into the cold void of space. The moment the turbulence vanished, an eerie silence filled the cockpit. C leaned back, slightly rolling his shoulders. His muscles were tight, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He turned to Vishari. "Time for answers." "All right," he said, voice firm. "We not dead so now? You're going to tell me what the hell is?" Vishari hesitated. She had known this moment was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. Kane watched her arms crossed. "I just stole a ship for you, took down trained mercenaries, pissed off someone powerful, and I don't even know why that's a problem." She was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I was never meant to exist." Kane frowned. "Care to elaborate on that?" Vishari swallowed. "The Artha value genetic perfection. Every child is engineered, tested, shaped before birth. Defects are removed." Kane's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. "And you?" She lifted a hand, tracing a slow pattern along the armrest. "I wasn't supposed to survive when they discovered my blindness. My stepmother wanted me." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Erased. Kane clenched his fists. He had seen a lot of ugly things in his time, but the casual way she said it made his stomach turn. "And your father, he spared me," she said quietly, "but at a cost. He did me away, let the world believe I was dead. I became a secret." C exhaled, shaking his head down. "That's brutal." A small smile ghosted her lips. "It was, but I adapt." She tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes unreadable. "I learned to hear things no one else could, to feel the world through sound and vibration, to move unseen. My blindness became my strength." Kane couldn't deny that he had watched her fight, watch her move in ways no ordinary person could, but that still didn't explain the mercenaries. "That doesn't answer why they're after you now." Vishar's fingers tined slightly against the armrest. "Because I'm not just blind." C stilled. "What does that mean?" She hesitated, but then with quiet resignation, she reached up and removed one of her gloves. Kane barely had time to register what he was looking at before she pressed her palm to the console. The ship reacted instantly. Lights flickered, systems pulsed, the interface recognized her touch, responding as if she were a registered pilot. Kane stared. "You're interfacing with the ship." Vishari withdrew her hand, her expression unreadable. "I shouldn't be able." Kane ran a hand through his hair. "Explain now." She took a slow breath. "The array are organic beings, but they've spent centuries integrating technology into their genetics. Only high-ranking officials and engineered specialists can interface directly with machines. She flexed her fingers. I was never supposed to have that ability. She leaned back, letting the information settle. That's why they want you, he muttered. You're something they didn't intend to create. Visheri nodded. Something they thought they destroyed. She let out a low whistle. All right, that's one hell of a reason to put a price on your head. He could only imagine what someone would pay for an Uri who could do what she did, a genetic anomaly, capable of merging with technology in a way her kind had never seen. Governments would want her, corporations would hunt for her, and now she was sitting in his co-pilot seat. Damn it, she muttered. I really stepped into it this time. Visheri smiled slightly. You didn't have to stay. Yeah, well, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I've never been good at walking away from a bad decision. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Kane straightened. All right, first priority, getting off the grid. This ship has a tracking beacon, and I guarantee those mercenaries have friends. Visheri nodded. Can you disable it? Kane grinned. I can do better. I can make it look like we're headed in the opposite direction. He moved to the console, fingers flying over the controls. Within moments, the beacon set a false signal toward a distant star system, buying them time. Visheri watched him, curiosity flickering across her face. You're good at it. I've had practice. She leaned back in her seat. What were you before this? Kane hesitated, then smirked. Trouble. Visheri laughed softly. It was a rare, genuine sound. He glanced at her. You trust me? She met his gaze, her silver eyes calm. I think I have to. C's smirk faded into something more serious. Yeah. And I think I just made some very dangerous enemies for you. Visheri exhaled, looking out into the vast stretch of space ahead of them. You didn't make them for me, Can. They were always there. He watched her for a moment longer before turning back to the controls. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what Visheri was. And whoever had sent those mercenaries wouldn't stop until they had her, or until Kane made sure they never got the chance. The hum of the ship's engines pulsed through the cabin, steady but subdued. They weren't out of danger, yet not even close. Kane's grip on the controls was firm, his eyes scanning the starfield ahead. The stolen ship was fast, but not fast enough. The Arathi Hunter class vessels trailing behind them were sleek, built for pursuit and interception. They wouldn't stop until they had Viri, or until Kane found a way to shake them. The cockpit lights cast a dim glow over Visheri's face as she sat in the co-pilot seat, eerily calm, but Kane knew better. She wasn't calm. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, her silver eyes unfocused. But Kane had already learned she didn't need sight to perceive the world. She could feel the subtle shifts in energy, the faint mechanical pulses of the ships behind them, even the tension in his own muscles. They're gaining on us, she murmured. Kane exhaled sharply. Yeah. I noticed. He flicked a switch, diverting more power to the rear thrusters. The stolen ship jolted forward, but the hunters adjusted effortlessly, maintaining pursuit. The cowls crackled. A voice, cold, authoritative, and elite patient, filled the cabin. Unidentified vessel. You are harboring stolen Arathi property. Power down on your engines and prepare to be boarded. Visheri tensed beside him. Property, that's what they called her. Khan's jaw tightened. Not happening. The voice didn't waver. You cannot outrun us. Kane smirked, flicking the comms off. Watch me. He jerked the ship into a sudden dive, spiraling toward a dense asteroid belt just beyond the planetary rings. The move was reckless, stupid even. But he had been in worse situations. The hunter ships followed, adjusting formation as they closed in. Zigzag between tumbling rocks, threading through narrow gaps where the larger vessels couldn't easily follow. The ship rattled violently as debris struck the hull. This is a terrible plan, Visheri noted. Kane flashed a grin. I thrive on terrible plans. Another impact shook the ship harder. This time, Kane's grin faded. All right, maybe this was a particularly terrible plan. Visheri's hands clenched against the console. She could feel the Arathi ships moving through the field, tracking them, predicting their course. The hunters weren't panicking. They were waiting. This won't work, she said suddenly. They're not chasing us. They're hurting us. Kane swore under his breath. He adjusted course, but it was too late. The asteroid's thin out ahead opening into a dead zone of empty space, a trap. The moment they cleared the last of the debris, 3 more Hunter-class ships emerged from the void, cutting off their escape. Kane tightened his grip on the controls. Well, that's unfortunate, vicious. Breath came shallow now. Her body tensed. The air in the cabin felt heavier. They weren't getting out of this. With a simple trick, the comms buzzed again, the same cold voice returning. "This is your final warning. Surrender now." Visheri looked at Kane, her expression unreadable. "If they take me, I won't come back." Kane didn't respond immediately. His mind was running through every possible maneuver, every possible escape route. None of them looked good. He could fight. But a single stolen mercenary ship against 5 Hunter-class vessels, that was suicide side. He could run, but they were boxed in. Or he glanced at Vishari. Or they could do something completely insane. "Can you do it again?" he asked. She frowned. "Do what? That thing you did back on the ship when you shut down the mercenary systems?" Vishari hesitated. "I don't know. I didn't do it on purpose." Kane exhaled. "Well, now would be a great time to figure it out." She swallowed hard, her fingers flexing slightly. The enemy ships were preparing to fire. They had seconds. Vishari closed her eyes. She placed her hands flat against the console, and she pushed. At first nothing happened. Then the pulse. Kane felt it more than saw it. A shift in the air, a ripple of unseen energy radiating outward. The ship's lights flickered. The air around Vishari hummed with something unnatural, something alive. The Hunter ship staggered mid-flight. Kane sensors flared with static. The enemy vessels, all 5 of them, flickered in and out of detection, their systems shorting, failing. Vishari gasped, her body trembling. Kane saw his opening. He didn't hesitate. He took it. He slammed the throttle forward, the ship rocketing past the disabled A before they could recover. The moment they cleared the dead zone, C rerouted every ounce of energy into the hyperdrive. The stars stretched into infinity, and they were gone. The ship drifted in the quiet aftermath of the jump, the engines humming at a low, steady pulse. Kane let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said finally, "I really need you to start telling me what you can do before we almost die." Vishari sat slumped in her seat, her hands still pressed against the console. She looked drained, pale even beneath her green complexion. "I didn't know if it would work," she admitted, her voice shaky. Kane studied her. "It did, but I'm guessing that wasn't easy." She shook her head. "It felt like I was reaching into something bigger than me, like it was pulling me in." That sent a chill down Kane's spine. "That's not normal." Vishari exhaled, her silver eyes meeting his. "None of this is normal." He couldn't argue with that. Kane leaned back in his seat. "All right, so let's take stock of our situation. We're flying a stolen ship with no long-term escape plan. The Arathi know exactly what you are now. And oh yeah, I just made myself a high-priority enemy of a powerful alien government." Vishari gave a tired smile. "You didn't have to stay." Kane snorted. "Yeah, well, I've made some bad choices before, but this one's really shaping up to be one of my best." She blinked, surprised. "See?" Shrug. "You're alive. We're still flying. I'd say that's a win." Vishari smile softened. "I suppose it is, but deep down Kane knew they had on. Will he bought themselves time. The Arathi wouldn't stop, and Vishari was running out of places to hide. The stolen ship landed in silence, dust rising in thin clouds around it. The ruined facility stretched before them, half buried beneath shifting sands. This was where it all began, and this was where it would end. The Sherry stepped onto the cold ground, her body tense, but steady this time. She wasn't running beside her. Kane checked, his blaster eyes sweeping the landscape. He didn't like this. The Aerie had been relentless in their pursuit, yet ever since they escaped Havoc's refuge, there had been no more Hunter ships, no more attacks. It didn't make sense. Why had they suddenly stopped? Vishari could feel it too, a strange stillness in the air, like something was watching. They walked through the shattered corridors of the facility, past broken machinery and the ghosts of forgotten experiments. The deeper they went, the more Vishar's senses tingled, not with fear, but with recognition. At the center of it all they found the console, the same one that had revealed the truth last time, the one that had whispered her past into existence. Vishari swallowed hard, then placed her hands on the cold metal. A pulse of energy rippled through her. The console recognized her, access granted. The screens flickered, and then a voice, her familiar, the woman from before. "If you're hearing this, it means..." The project has been compromised. The Arthi will not allow its existence to be known. They will erase everything. Vishar breath caught the message, continued, but there is something they fear more than failure. Kane frowned. What does that mean? Vishar's fingers twitched. She could feel it now. The answer was here, just beyond reach. She pressed deeper, searching, pulling the system apart thread by thread, and then she found it, a final command, a directive embedded in the heart of the airy network. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the realization hit. They were never just hunting me, she whispered. They were making sure I never activated. Kun's jaw tightened. Activated? Rari turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't just an experiment. I was a fail-safe. Kan's breath caught for what the console flickered again, revealing a final encrypted file, the war protocol. Vishari stared in horror. They were preparing for war with humanity. The array had spent centuries perfecting genetic engineering technology and control, but they knew that one day the humans would challenge them. And when that day came, they would need a weapon, a bridge between species, a hybrid capable of interfacing with human and tech. That was Vishari, but something had gone wrong. Someone had hidden her away before she could be used. And now the array weren't just trying to erase her, they were waiting, because if she connected with the wrong system, if she fully activated, it could trigger something even they couldn't control. Kane exhaled sharply. That's why they backed off. They realized if they pushed too hard, they might cause the very thing they were trying to prevent. Vishari took a shaky breath. They were afraid I might be the key to something they couldn't predict. A long silence stretched between them. Then Kane smirked. Well, that's a hell of a thing to learn about yourself. Vishari let out a small breathless laugh. You have no idea, but deep down she felt something she hadn't before. Power, not just the kind that connected to machine means, but the power of choice. She wasn't a mistake. She wasn't an accident. She was something new, and the array were too afraid to find out what that meant. They left the facility behind, the past buried beneath the ruins. The ship soared into the stars, silent except for the soft hum of the engines. He leaned back in the pilot's seat, watching Viz as she sat beside him. He exhaled. So what now? Vishari turned toward him, her silver eyes calm for the first time. She wasn't lost. I find the others, she said. If I exist, there could be more. Kane smirked. And if there aren't? Vishari expression didn't waver. Then I make sure no one else suffers like this again. Kane studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. You're not doing it alone. Vishari smiled. I know. There was a warmth in her chest that hadn't been there before, a certainty, a purpose. Kane turned to her, his voice quieter now. And what about you? Do you still want to fix your eyes? Vishari reached out, tracing her fingers along his jaw. I don't need to see you, Kane. His breath hitched as she leaned closer, her lips brushing against his, slow, certain. She didn't need her sight to know what she wanted. Kane smiled against her lips. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. The ship's engines roared as they set a new course, not for another escape, but for the future. Vishari wasn't running anymore. She was going to change everything. The stars stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time neither of them was running. C sat in the pilot's seat, feet propped up on the console, watching Vishari as she leaned back beside him. She looked peaceful, no tension in her shoulders, no fear in her expression, just calm. So said, smirking, we actually made it. Vishari turned her head slightly toward him, a small smile playing on her lips. We did no more hunters, no more hiding. The Arathi had backed off. They knew now that Vishari wasn't a mistake. She was something they couldn't predict, couldn't control, and that terrified them. Kane stretched. I could get used to this. No explosions, no one trying to kill us. He glanced at her. You sure you won't miss the running? Vishari chuckled, shaking her head. Not even a little. She reached for his hand, fingers lacing through his. Kane squeezed back his grip, warm, steady. They had survived together, and now they would live together. Vishari exhaled deeply, letting it all go, the fear, the uncertainty. She turned toward Kane, her voice soft. Where do we go now? Kane smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. Anywhere we want. And for the first time, they weren't escaping, they were free. The end.